how they work. And then I will talk about text to image prompting and how to prompt to get the most effective results when using an AI image generator. Then I will talk about some of the philosophy and ethics of AI and generated images and some tips for incorporating visual literacy and AI into your instruction. And I plan to leave a little bit of room at the end for any discussion. Okay, so I want to start with a few disclaimers. First of all, I am not an expert on AI. I try to reduce my own usage of AI as much as I possibly can, both in my personal and in my professional life. I'm very skeptical of AI, as I think many of us in the field of libraries are. But what I am presenting here is, what I've learned, how I'm approaching this, and I think that we're all coming from this different stages of interaction and experience with AI, and I invite us all to learn from one another. I also will not be debating whether or not to use AI. I've decided that my stance is not to tell students don't use it, but instead to inform them to the best of my ability of how I understand how it works and to give them the tools to help them make independent decisions of what's best for them and how to best use it. We will be discussing those ethical considerations though at the end. And also this session is going to focus specifically on visual literacy. So I'm not going to talk about all the other aspects of information literacy, and I won't cover other types of generative AI in this session, just those that pertain to visuals. And this session will be interactive. We'll be doing some different activities and I will be inviting people. Is there a chat component? Perfect. Okay, so I will be
Yes.
inviting people to use the chat, and it's also not an exhaustive coverage on the topic. Obviously, we only have about 45 minutes together. Okay, so what is visual literacy? Well, in 2011, ACRL adopted the Visual Literacy Competency Standards, and you may recall that that was in the era of the Information Literacy Company Standards before the framework was adopted. And essentially, that defined visual literacy as a set of abilities that enables an individual to effectively find, interpret, evaluate, use, and create images in visual media. A few years ago, in 2022, ACRL finally updated that document and they created a companion piece to the framework that is called the Framework for Visual Literacy in Higher Education. And essentially, that is meant to be, again, if you consider visual literacy an extension of information literacy, that is a really great tool to be able to see how to incorporate visual literacy into your instruction that already is informed by the framework. But what they did is they have 4 different kind of components to it. So learners participate in changing the visual information landscape. Learners perceive visuals as communicating information. Learners practice visual discernment and criticality, and learners pursue social justice through visual practice. Interestingly, AI is not mentioned in the document specifically, but there's certainly elements to it where you can see how a session that is on artificial intelligence would incorporate some aspects of this companion piece. And again, as I kind of stated at the beginning, to me, working with visual information is multidisciplinary. I have, faculty from the School of Dentistry who have called and asked if they can use the art library because if you think about when you get dental work done, it's very cosmetic and there's an aesthetic to it, right? So having good visuals is really important for practicing doctors and for medical students. So really any discipline out there is going to use some type of visual. And again, that doesn't just mean an image, a painting, or what we might consider a work of art. It could be charts, graphs, maps, photographs, and more. Okay, so to get started, we're going to do a quick self-reflection exercise. And so in the chat, please think of 5 words that describe how you feel about AI with particular focus to how AI can be used to generate images and other visual material. And I will give everybody just a minute here. Okay, I'm seeing complicated, duped, deceptive, conflicted, fun. So there's some positive elements perhaps. Dangerous, misleading, scary, stunning, challenging, concerning, environmentally unfriendly. So yeah, we've got a lot of different thoughts about AI, right? And some different reactions that we might have when it comes to using image generators. All right, getting back to my slides now. So we're going to start with an activity, and I'm calling this one Spot the Fake. And again, please use the chat for this. But of these 2 images of the Sydney Opera House, which one do you think was generated by AI? Okay, it looks like most people think number 2, and you would be correct. ChatGPT created this image with the prompt Sydney Opera House at sunset. What made you think, if you guessed number 2, that this was AI generated? Looks too perfect, the colors too pretty. Yeah, I mean, there's almost like a too good to be true, right, element sometimes. Okay, next one. Which image is AI? 1 or 2? Okay, it looks like people are pretty mixed on this one. It is image 1. So on the right, image 2 is a photograph of the Stall House, and on the left was a prompt to ChatGPT to generate a photo of the Stall House at twilight. Now that you know which one was AI generated, what what characteristics of image 1 maybe give it away? Unrealistic composition, open window over an unsafe ledge, too polished, the lighting, light reflection in the water, weird line, pool doesn't have a railing, could be an infinity pool. Lights and lack of realistic shadowing. Yeah, and I think, we're already kind of seeing you really have to look at these for a minute to really determine. And it might be easier when they're side by side, but what if you were just looking at one of these images on their own and you weren't familiar with the original, work, given that these are photographs? Okay, I think this might be the last example. So which one of these images is AI? 1 or 2? This is like being at the eye doctor. Okay, I think we might have consensus for the first time. It's image 1, y'all. So image 2, this is called the Cardboard Cathedral. This is in New Zealand. This photo was taken in 2013. And image 1, the prompt was cardboard cathedral interior with stained glass in ChatGPT. And I think one thing that maybe confuses both of these images is the fact that there's chairs that look exactly alike that are, completely lined up. Okay, so, this is an activity you can do with students. Show them a couple of different examples. You can take an original work. In this case, all of these were works of architecture, photographs of architecture, but you can really do anything. And then have students guess which one, and that can be a great conversation starter. And so, how do you know if an image was AI generated? Well, sometimes it can be a little obvious, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that when we start looking at some of the different tools, because some are better than others. But of course, there are AI detection tools, and I have a couple that are listed on the slide here. You can do a Google image search where you can see if you can find an original somewhere on the web, and sometimes that is a helpful way of determining whether or not it's real. Anyone have a mechanism that they've used or had success with, or a specific detection tool? If so, please let us know in the chat. There are so many out there. So I'm going to start talking a little bit now about how these images are created. And I will, again, just a disclaimer here, this actually creating the algorithms and all of the technology that goes into generating images is really beyond what I do and what I really understand. But this is to the best of my ability as I've tried to grasp, these concepts of how I understand it. So there's two different models. The most common model for creating AI images is a diffusion model. And this image here kind of shows you the process of what happens. But essentially, what these data sets do is what these models do is working with data sets. They take an existing image and they add what's called noise, and then they try to create that image from the noise. So their goal is to try to replicate that image as much as they possibly can to varying, effects. So that difference between the original image and that generated image is loss. For a user, you put in a prompt and it creates a noise image, random with no structure. It adds detail to that noise image through the diffusion process while maintaining the structure of the image. And then it uses a neural network trained on a data set of real images to generate an image through the diffusion process until desired results are achieved. And so sometimes it might take multiple iterations of prompting or working with that tool to get something that results in something that you're, happy with. So that's the diffusion model. The second model is GANs, or a generative adversarial network. This machine learning model consists of two networks. There's a generator and a discriminator. So it's a little bit more complex than the diffusion model. The generator generates images from random noise. The discriminator tries to distinguish between what is a real image and what is the generated image. And so in the training process for these models, it's adversarial, where the generator tries to create an image so realistic it cannot be distinguished from the original. In other words, this generator is trying to outsmart the discriminator into making it think that it wasn't actually AI generated. They're less common than the diffusion model. So most of the AI image generators that we will use are going to be based on a diffusion model, simply because the GANs involves that two-step process, which makes it more complex, more difficult to train, more unwieldy, etc. It tends to be a little bit more unstable. So now I'm going to go into 3 different tools and talk about some of the characteristics of each one. And after I do that, we'll have an activity. We'll have 2 more activities in this session. One will be on prompting, and one will be actually using a tool of your choice and being able to play around with it and share kind of your thoughts. So DALL-E is based on a diffusion model, and this is a text encoder that maps prompts into a shared latent space. There is, DALL-E is used by different image generators, but probably the most common or popular one is ChatGPT. So if you use ChatGPT to make images, as you saw in the spot the fake activity, those were using DALL-E as the sort of model. And ChatGPT, along with many of these other tools, there's likely going to be a free version. And then if you want more complex editing tools or capabilities, you're going to have to pay for it. I will just go ahead and, disclose here, I don't pay for any of these. So there is a limit in some ways of what I'm able to do, but that's just, I personally don't want to pay for any of these tools. And we don't have an institutional subscription at U of L for image generators. So the result with ChatGPT is that it tends to produce a very literal response to your prompt. And what that can mean is that you will get an image that kind of looks a little off, which makes you think that it might be AI. It requires feedback, usually, in some cases, multiple iterations of feedback before it will give you a result that is satisfactory. And again, it tends to have that sort of AI generated look. So an example of a prompt that I put into ChatGPT is create an image of a university library reading room with large windows, wood floors, and large shared wood tables. If you have any initial thoughts about this image, feel free to put them in the chat. But I think most of us can probably agree that right away, you sort of notice something is off about that. First of all, we know libraries don't really look like that. There's something off about the lighting. It's like too warm, a little too yellow. There's just books very neatly stacked around the tables. The backpacks, there's backpacks placed at the end of every single table that look exactly alike, right? I mean, it might give you the feeling of being in a library reading room, but like we know that that's not really what our spaces look like. So in an attempt to refine the results a little bit, I gave the feedback to add more books and remove the people, and this is what it did. Those book bags are gone. Instead, we just have even more stacks of books on the table. So for me to kind of get an image that I would actually want to use would take probably quite a bit of tweaking in the prompting process. So now we're going to talk about Midjourney. And actually, before I get into that, I remember now, I wanted to I have all of these up on my browser because I just wanted everybody to know how you get there. So if you're on ChatGPT, you'll go over to this Images tab, and that's where you can put in your prompt and use it as an image generator. All right, going back to my slides now. Okay, sorry, I'm clearly not doing this very often. Okay, here we go. We're going to talk about Midjourney now. So Midjourney is a paid subscription only. So I've never actually used Midjourney from its full user capabilities where it gives you the features as if you were a paid subscriber. Subscriptions are reasonably priced, if you will, starting at around $10 a month. The model type is unknown. In other words, where exactly they have those data sets are coming from that they've been able to train this system on is unknown. Some people speculate it's coming from Instagram, but they're not really disclosing this. It is more interpretive than literal. It can look like AI still, but it's highly stylized. There's a lot of different capabilities and tools and ways that you can create some really interesting things. And because of that, it is preferred by creators. So a lot of art students who are interested in engaging with an AI tool might prefer Midjourney over obviously something like ChatGPT that's just very literal. It is highly customizable, so you can specify aspect ratio, style, upscaling seeds. You can really get very detailed with your prompt. And interesting, I will go ahead actually and escape from this to show you Midjourney's website. These tools are changing all the time. And when I first went to their website, it was like, I don't understand where I'm going. Do they not do images anymore? I was a little confused. Then I saw they've expanded quite a bit. So if you want to use Midjourney for images, you click on this image and video models, and this is what it looks like. But they actually are starting to do medical imaging, which is really interesting. So this is a tool that is, I don't understand. How do I just share it? Oh, I think I am. Okay. So this is an example from Midjourney, and you can see this is a prompt. And so because I don't have access, I basically just went to that page where you're able to just explore different options, and I just downloaded an image from there. But this was the prompt that was used to make this image. So you can see it's very lengthy and very detailed. And frankly, the result, I would not know that that was AI generated. Like, it looks like actual fabric that has been, sewn together. Again, you can see the difference between something like this and ChatGPT, I think, right away, and why this costs money. Okay, so last but not least, I'm going to just talk about Stable Diffusion. So Stable Diffusion is a product of Stability AI, the parent company, and it's a latent diffusion model that was trained on a massive data set scraped from the web. It is more of like an open source type tool. So there is a free version that allows for some use. They use a token model, so I don't think it's quite actually accurate that you can just do 20 free images. It depends on what you do and how complex that is and how quickly you get through those tokens. But there is the ability to go in and use it if you've never used it before, just to check it out. It's very high quality image generation and editing capabilities, again, compared to something like ChatGPT. Because it is open source, they don't have the same process for employees going in and double checking things, checking for bias and things like that. So there tends to be a little bit more bias in the results here. It's highly customizable, but the thing about Stable Diffusion that's interesting is you can specify different styles of art or different artists and say, do this in the style of classical art, do this in the style of Albrecht Dürer. Like, it kind of has all of that knowledge and can generate from that. Whether or not it should be able to do that might be a different question. You can prompt by image, so you can put in an image and have it create something similar. And you can also do a negative prompt where you can specify, I don't want you to add these different features or characteristics. And you can also vary an image. So if you are like, I just want this to be tweaked a little bit, you can tell it to vary, and then you can play around a little bit with that. So here's an example. The prompt was create an image of a university library reading room with large windows, wood floors, and large shared wood tables. So you can see this probably also still looks AI generated, but arguably might look a little bit more realistic than the image we got from ChatGPT. And so what I did is I just said to vary that. And so one of the things that it did is it interpreted that by different perspectives and viewpoints. So we see like the corner of a table and some of the details of that table, and then it's a little bit, more blurred in the background. So that's kind of how you can use Stable Diffusion. Just like I think using any type of AI generator, it's all about prompting, and AI image generators are no different. So I've already talked about how it's an iterative process. We all know that, right? Just like any type of research that you do or inquiry that you make, you're going to have to refine and give it feedback to get, better results that are going to be more effective. But what I also want to say here, especially from the perspective of a librarian, is that background knowledge is still really important when prompting. Students who don't know anything about what they're about these images, like, cannot just go in and give a prompt without having some knowledge of what they're looking for or the vocabulary or the topic. So background information and research is still really important to being able to do an effective prompt. The other thing that I think about prompting that's so important is that we have to be really intentional with the way that we prompt, because the better prompts we give it, the less prompting we have to do and the less we're using the AI tool, and therefore the less impact we might have on the environment. And so I believe very much in taking time to craft prompt. And it's a new skill, right? And it is going to depend on the tool that you're using, the way that you prompt it. And it does take some time to kind of play around with it. So for word count, shorter is going to be more clear, longer is going to be more specific. So there's sort of a sweet spot of clarity and specificity that you have to reach. So generally 5 to 10 words, but as we saw in that Midjourney example, it might even get more detailed than that. It just depends on the tool. Sentence structure is something we don't really need to use. So just like when we're talking about searching in databases, what are your key concepts? You can separate that with commas. Word specificity is also important here. So for example, if you say a computer mouse, it could give you an actual computer mouse. It could give you an image of a mouse on a mouse on a computer mouse. So you have to kind of be careful, like how you word certain things, because you don't, the AI tool might interpret in a really different way from what you mean. And homonyms, so like bank, for example, if you really mean like a river bank, you should maybe think of a different word or add a little bit more description to that, because it might think you're talking about like a financial bank, for example. Think about what you don't really need to say, because again, we still want to be clear, and there may be some aspects to your prompt that you don't really need to put in the tool. And visual style. So visual style for some of these tools like the Midjourney or Stable Diffusion was something that those tools can do and can handle, and that can really impact the output that it gives you. And you can also specify composition and framing. So if you want an aerial view, if you want a close up, if you want a certain perspective, like make sure it knows that from the beginning when you're prompting. Okay, so activity 2, I am cognizant of the fact that we only have 15 minutes left, so I might go through these a little bit quickly, but this is an example of something that you can do with students. So you can have students work on a prompt. And actually, one way that I might want to do this is before we even touch a computer screen or a keyboard, have a worksheet or a piece of paper or something, have them brainstorm and write out some of those different keywords, and have them brainstorm on paper, essentially, before they actually start to use a computer. I think that that's always really helpful. It gets them to think more critically and intentionally about what they're asking for before they actually go in and craft that prompt. So I will go ahead and skip this part. But now I'll get a little bit into the philosophy and ethics piece of all of this. And as an art librarian, I have been very wary of AI because I have seen that as threatening the artists that I care so much about and that I work so closely with. It's not, a secret that a lot of creators have had their works used by AI without their consent or their permission, and that's very problematic, of course. I have also come to think about this a little bit differently, though, and I want to share this with you because this may be a perspective you haven't considered yet. And that is that AI is just another form of technology. It is a problematic technology. And again, I'm not here to argue about whether or not we should be using AI or embracing it or anything like that. There are certainly problems with it, but it is a technology. And technology has presented various kinds of threats or disruptions to the visual arts for a long time now. So what's more important? Is it the idea? Is it the execution of the idea? What does it mean to create? Who is the creator? And is generative AI maybe actually just the next evolution in creative assistance or editing tools like Photoshop? We had a professor that I interviewed last year for another presentation that I gave with some colleagues of mine at U of L on basically disciplinary perceptions of AI and how faculty are using it in their teaching and their research. And I was really interested to hear that one of our painting professors was actively engaged in using AI in her work and had actually used it to create a data set of her own paintings and her own works, and was using it to generate like new ideas and kind of using it as like a thought partner in some ways and building upon that to make future works. And so there are artists that are actively using AI in that way, and that's not inherently bad to me. So I'll go through a really brief history of how technology has impacted art. This quote, "From today, painting is dead." Paul de la Roche said this in 1839. Does anybody have any guesses what Paul de la Roche was referring to? Exactly. This right here, photography. So in our libraries, photography is classified in Library of Congress as TR. It was considered a technology. It was not considered an art form when it was first invented. It took some time for it to kind of be elevated in that way. And this is one of the earliest examples of photography. This is Boulevard du Temple by Daguerre from 1838. And this is considered one of the very first photographs capturing human likeness. There was a very long exposure in early photography. And so getting humans who are usually in movement was very difficult to capture. But there is speculation that this figure over here may have been having his shoes shined or was propping his foot up on some sort of monument or something. It's really hard to kind of know exactly what was going on there. But this was very threatening, particularly to portrait painters, who really saw this as being the very end of their careers, because if photography can capture somebody's likeness, what exactly do they have to give anymore? Fast forward a couple of decades to Marcel Duchamp in 1917 coming out with the fountain, which is basically an upside down urinal. And this is an example of a ready-made, or taking an ordinary object and then elevating it to art because the artist decides that it is art, that it meets their vision, their intention of what they, want to create or how they want to present an object. Is that art? There has been a long debate about whether or not it is. Sol LeWitt in 1976. Wall drawing number 289. This was installed at the Whitney Museum in New York. What these wall drawings actually are a series of instructions that Sol LeWitt designed that then could be used by curators as instructions for literally installing this work in their museums. Sol LeWitt did not do the installation of this, and because it's an installation type of work based on instructions, you could kind of argue he didn't really have anything to do in some ways with the actual installation of this piece, other than he designed the instructions. So is this creator? Is this art? Right? Again, still kind of in that territory. David Hockney, an RIP because he just recently passed away. He has done a lot of iPad drawings. This is one of the series, Untitled Number 9 from the Yosemite Suite. When you're working on like a tablet, for example, that's very different than pen and paper or a canvas or something where you're using what has been traditionally classified as like art materials. So is this art? Does it change? Does your perception of it change because you're using technology? And finally, I'll end with The Comedian by Maurizio Catlin, which caused a lot of uproar in the art world because it is literally a banana duct taped to a wall. Obviously, this banana doesn't live forever. You have to switch out the banana. So essentially, this was sold for $6.2 million at the auction house Sotheby's because it came with a certificate of authenticity and instructions. And basically, the person who spent $6 million on it knows how to switch out the banana and the duct tape. Is that art? You see where I'm getting with this, right? Like the question of what exactly is art, what is original, this has all been debated for a really long time. And this quote by Melvin Kranzberg in 1986, so technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. We know AI is not neutral. It also may inherently of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. What we do with it can be bad. But it also is not necessarily threatening to creators or the visual arts. I still think that there is an opportunity here for original works because AI can only regurgitate what it already knows. It can't actually create something new. So that has given me a lot of hope when thinking about this technology and how it has disrupted so much of our work in libraries, but also what I've seen it do for the visual arts faculty and students that I work with. And so just touching briefly upon the ethics, because you could talk for hours about all of this, of course. So for copyright infringement, where you're using the works of others without their knowledge or consent, there are, of course, numerous lawsuits that have happened with these different AI tools. I will call out Anderson versus Stability AI here as one of them. Stability AI being the parent company that created Stable Diffusion. We know AI is trained on biased data sets, and that in of itself can create a very problematic result. And deep fakes are a particularly problematic area of AI in which there are highly realistic AI videos or images of people doing things that they didn't actually do. And it can be really hard to disprove that it's not, real. It can damage somebody's reputation. There's obviously a lot of issues with that. I'm not getting so much into that, but I just want to acknowledge that that is a facet here when we're talking about information. That is a very problematic thing that can result by using AI to generate visual content. So for evaluating AI tools, I will introduce everybody here to Catherine Copper from the University of Toronto. She has created this framework called Valid AI. And so validate the data, analyze the algorithms, consider any legal or ethical considerations. So if you're using Stable Diffusion, it's really good to know if they've been actively involved in a lawsuit, for example. Any diversity and bias that you might detect in those results or that other people have reported in that tool or in the data set. An accuracy check, how accurate is this? Particularly important when you're creating generative images of existing things like architecture or other, known works or people. And then reflect on your own purpose and usage. I really like this as a framework for talking to students about using AI, again, in the context of generating visual information, because I love that reflection piece of getting them to really think about what exactly their intention is and what they're planning to use that for. In some cases, it may not be the best idea to use an AI tool. And I believe in empowering students to help them come to that conclusion themselves. And I also want to remind everybody that citing generative AI is also incredibly important. So all major citation styles now have information on how you cite AI generated content. And you typically need the title, which might be a description of the image. It's good practice to save all of your prompts, because more and more it's expected that you're actually showing what you prompted to make that image. You also need to know the different versions of tools that you're using. So Stable Diffusion, for example, right now is at 3.5. Whenever it comes out with 4 or whatever is next, it could be a very different feature from what you used, and that is important to showcase. Whoever the company is, that would be the alternative to a publisher, the date that image was generated, when it was created, If there is a URL, sometimes you will be able to do that so that there can be a like permalink of sorts to go back to that image. And students, I think, have long kind of forgotten that any type of visual material that they use still needs to be cited, and that is still very much the case whenever we are generating images. And for visual literacy and AI instruction, I've talked a little bit throughout the presentation about how I might talk with students about this, but a couple of other ideas I'll leave you with. So one is doing some prompting, think, pair, share. So I already talked about how I like to use paper and kind of jot down some ideas. You can have students do that, pair with a partner, and kind of get feedback before we even get into using an AI tool. I love doing student-led demonstrations when I'm doing a class that does involve using a database or a tool or something where like we have to look at a screen. I think students pay more attention when a fellow classmate is talking to them. And it's a great way to immediately like they will figure out how to use it if they've had to actually like do it in front of their class. Then giving students time to just use that tool on their own, going around as a guide and answering questions, and then maybe having a discussion after people have had some time to practice generating. And then finally, attribution through peer review. So where they practice actually citing an image and kind of like the think, pair, share, but more in just the pair or a peer review where their classmate will give them some feedback about whether or not that's actually enough information to fully cite that image again to get them to sort of reiterate the importance of all of those different components instead of just the librarian or the instructor doing that. And for assessment, the reflection piece we did at the beginning, you can ask them that again at the end, and you can do a 1-minute paper. You know, what is something you're going to start doing? What's something you're going to stop doing? I think those work really well for something like an AI workshop that is in a lot of ways very personal. I know we're just about out of time. If anybody has any other words that they can think of that maybe they've thought about during this session of how you feel about AI and images, let me know if anything else comes to mind. And now there's maybe just a tiny bit of time for discussion. I do see a question in the chat from Amanda. And so how do you overcome student resistance to using AI? Many students are vehemently opposed and will not use it. I can tell you that a lot of the art students I work with are not using it and do not want to use it. And I completely understand that and I understand why. And I think I think there's two ways to approach this. One is if you are doing in a class where you have activities like this, offer an alternative that does not actually involve using an AI tool. I never want to force anybody to use something that they are not comfortable doing. The second thing is you will notice in this presentation, I talked a lot more about like how this stuff works. I'm actually a lot more interested in that than I am really using these tools because it's like how information is created. It's a new technology. It's swiftly changing and developing. I want to constantly stay up to date with how it works a lot more than I actually want to use it. I still think students need to understand how AI works. That doesn't mean that they have to use it though. And I see it's 1:45.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Courtney. I know we are at time, but if anyone has any last questions, you can pop those in really quick. This was amazing, though. This was so informative. I have lots of notes that I will be stealing for a class I'm working with in the fall. So it is very much appreciated. But yes, let's everybody give Courtney a Zoom round of applause, show some appreciation. Thank you so much. You've got some love in the chat, but
Thank you all.
Final questions. Thank you so much. All right.
And I will just add here, I will be at EKU tomorrow. So if you will also be there, you know, feel free to say hi. Thank you all.
Awesome. Yes. I'm excited to see everybody in person tomorrow. All right. So we have a break until 2 o'clock, and then we will have our final session of the afternoon. So everybody stretch, get some water, do what you need to do, and we'll see you back here at 2.